right, so I think it's time to start. As some of you may know, I am Julio Villagarcia from the Linguo, Theoretical Linguistics Research Group at the University of Oviedo, and also from the Department of Linguistics and English Language at the University of Manchester. And I'm here today in my capacity as scientific coordinator of the Bilingualism series of the Instituto Cervantes of Manchester and Leeds. As you know, the main purpose of this series is to organize a number of knowledge transfer talks on a range of topics surrounding the fascinating issue of bilingualism. And today it is the issue of language learning that we will be addressing here. Thus, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce to you Mr. John Wilson. Mr. Wilson, who will be delivering the lecture WoLLoW, a new way of looking at language learning as part, as I said, of the 2022 Bilingualism series organized by the Instituto Cervantes of Manchester and Leeds. We would like to thank our sponsors, the University of Manchester, the Consulate General of Spain, the University of Oviedo, and of course the Instituto Cervantes. John Wilson undertook his BA in Spanish and a PGCE at the University of Hull. He then did an MPhil degree at the University of Manchester. This was in the field of literature. And he has actually written various journal and bulletin articles on co-curricular languages, as well as partnerships for languages. A teacher of Spanish, since 2014, John has been the head of modern languages at Chiddlehume School. From 2015 to 2020, John was vice chair of the Independent Schools Modern Languages Association, and since then has been their lead for partnerships. John Wilson has also been part of the team that came up with the concept of WoLLoW, World of Languages, Languages of the World. Another co-founder is present here in the virtual room. This was back in 2019, after several years wondering what to do with primary languages and how to unite English, classical languages, and modern languages in secondary education settings. This year, John has ventured into publishing readers for students of Spanish, which, in addition to promoting reading and developing language, help build cultural capital among students and are also multidisciplinary in nature. For instance, they address themes of diversity. His first book of this type was actually published a few months ago in July and is entitled Somos Edu, Neus y Hassan. We are Edu, Neus, and Hassan. And this publication narrates three parallel stories of these children, Edu, Neus, and Hassan, who visit Madrid during the San Isidro Festival. Well, lots of interesting stuff going on. I can really wait to hear John speak. So please, without further ado, join me in welcoming Mr. John Wilson. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I just check that everyone can hear me okay? Does this sound okay, Julio? Good. Yeah, I will share my slides now. So I will do the talk in English, but as your questions come up, please feel free to put them in the chat. They're fine to be in Spanish or in English, and indeed the questions we have at the end, the session can be a bilingual session of English and Spanish, and there may even be other languages represented in the room, which we can cater for as well. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. There's a slight change to the title that you might have seen, where there was a focus on WoLLoW in the title. I was just aware that perhaps not all the audience would know what WoLLoW was, so I've made it a bit more generic in primarily secondary languages in the UK. It might be better to call that in England, actually, because if you look to Scotland and Northern Ireland in particular, I do think they're doing things better than we are here in England. So can we do things better? And the three organisations, first of all, my school is based in the south of Manchester, and it's a real honour to be part of a community where we have the Cervantes Institute on our doorstep, and it's certainly a fantastic resource that I, as a teacher, use regularly. I also encourage my students to use, especially my sixth form students. I'm always telling them to come on, join the Jorge Edwards Library for goodness sake, join the Hockey Edwards Library. You're so lucky to have this on your doorstep. Some of them ignore me, but some of them do take notice of me and make the most of that. The other organisation, ISMLA, that's the Independent Schools Modern Language Association. The Independent Schools Modern Language Association represents independent schools or private schools in the UK with modern languages, but it also encourages partnerships between independent schools, which are often very well resourced, and encourages partnership between independent schools and state-funded schools as well. And that's my main role in ISMLA, to try and find ways about how we can collaborate across the independent sector in the UK and the state-funded sector. And the final organisation there, perhaps the most relevant to this talk, is WoLLoW. And as Julio has already mentioned, John Clausen, who is in the audience, is a fellow sort of co-founder. And I may have got my dates wrong for how long we've been in existence, so John will no doubt correct me if I was wrong with 2019. But certainly we've been thinking about what we can do for further back than that, since further back than that. So WoLLoW stands for the World of Languages and Languages of the World. We shorten it to WoLLoW because that's what hippos tend to do, and hence we have our symbol for organisation, which is the hippo. Okay. Now, apologies. Now, so I want to think about in England itself, what are our issues for modern language learning with primary curricula, primary to secondary transition, and the lower secondary school curricula. Now, I'm quite interested to, if I just stop the share for a second, I'm quite interested if anyone in the room has knowledge of the English system, and perhaps can you put in the chat any issues that you see with the way languages are represented in the primary curricula, primary to secondary transition, and the lower secondary curricula? Any issues that you are aware of, that you know of, that you experience? If you can add those to the chat, that would be great. Good. Okay, so there's some interesting comments coming in, which I'll pick up on. So we've got focus on standardized tests instead of communication. Okay, the idea of no cultural elements, or barely any, from Gemma. So thank you to Julio and Gemma for that. So I'm going to share what I see as the issues for those sort of three stages. And I should add that I don't claim to be the expert here. I am just a Spanish teacher doing my best. Head of department in language as well, so I can't just think with a Spanish hat. I have to represent all the languages that not only taught in my school, but that are represented in my school. I think that's a big, an important distinction that we need to make. So I have to think about that, and I'm just doing my best with sometimes what is quite a poor hand that we are dealt in the UK. So first of all, in primary curricula, now I think it's important that we see a distinction. We have a fantastic partner school just outside of Barcelona, in a town some of you might be familiar with, called Mataró. It's called Escuela Meritxell, and I was lucky enough to go there as we were setting up the partnership in June. We're setting up an exchange with lots of e-learning opportunities as well, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on. But what I saw there was the gold standard of sort of a bilingual or even multilingual culture in a school. So obviously, school, is everything okay? Yeah. Okay. So already the school is completely bilingual with Castellano and Catalan, so already that is thriving. But from the age of 4, 5, we have the learners who are already gaining lots of confidence and competence in English, so that they're sort of foreign language as well. The reality is that we don't have that infrastructure for that to be the case in UK schools. I mean, there are a few reasons for that. First one is that which language should students be learning? Well, in lots of students in Europe, for example, in this school, that's not a question. They learn English as their foreign language. In the UK, that is a question. You know, Should there be one foreign language that dominates in the UK schools? I think we're opening a big can of worms by suggesting that. I know here we are doing a talk for the Cervantes Institute, so we might have a lot of support for Spanish being that language within this forum. But the reality is that can't be the case, because of the expertise of teachers might rest in French, in German, in Spanish. It might, and also we've got to think about the communities that these primary languages, that these primary schools represent, where, and I'll talk about those in a little while, where actually the languages that are most relevant to those young people might not be the traditional Spanish, French, or German, which you see on most sort of secondary school curricula. So if I stay with primary curricula, further issues we have are that, first of all, the staffing. There isn't necessarily the expertise for teaching languages. Okay, certainly one specific language to a good standard. There are lots of schools that go against that and book that trend, where they have they have experienced linguists on their staff, but that is the exception rather than the rule. And then the other reality is that how do you find time for effective language learning one single language in an already sort of congested curriculum in primary schools? So that is another area that we were looking at overcoming when we came up with the concept of WoLLoW. If I then go to the primary to secondary transition, so just for those of you not familiar with the English system, so at the ages of, so when students are at 10 and 11, ages 10 and 11, they are in the top year of primary school, that's year 6. Okay. Into year 7, they move to secondary school, where they will start language learning formally on the curriculum. Okay. The problem is as follows: that child at the end of year 6, at the end of primary school, has had a very different experience depending on which school they have attended. Okay. And the problems there is, what are the continuity when we get to year 7? That is a big problem that we face. The reality is that, let's say, sorry, can I just ask that we go on mute there, please? Thank you. So the reality is, if I take Julio, for example, let's say that Julio and I arrive in the same secondary school, okay, in September in
May
Manchester.
I ask you all to please mute your mics? I'm sorry.
No, that's not a problem. So let's say that Julio and I arrive at the same secondary school in September. We've just arrived 2 weeks ago in a secondary school in Manchester. We're really excited about learning languages. We've been put in a class where we're both learning Spanish. Okay. Now, Julio, as you might guess from his name, well, he's already got a bit of Spanish. In fact, he's got some Spanish family. That's not being considered when he's being put in the Spanish class. That's one problem. The other thing is that at Julio's primary school, they've been doing Spanish to a really good level, because they've had a Spanish specialist in the primary school. Just by chance, that person just happened to be there. So everyone who went to Julio's school, primary school, has made lots of progress with their Spanish in between years, say 3 to 6. In my school, on the other hand, we didn't really have time for languages. We were prioritizing maths and English. That was because my school struggled at inspection, where the inspector said, look, we really need to focus on the maths and English. So we did a little bit of Spanish. We had a few days where we had a Spanish day, and we all came dressed up as stereotypes as Spanish people, and we learned a few greetings and that sort of thing. And that was the extent of my Spanish. And here we are in the same Spanish class in year 7. So we have our first lesson. We're excited. I'm excited to learn Spanish. Julio's excited to pick up from where he left off. By the end of the lesson, and this is an exaggerated example, by the end of the lesson, we are both demotivated. Why are we both demotivated? Well, I'm sitting next to someone who is obviously so much better at Spanish than I have, and is so much further down the line. So I'm demotivated because I feel, oh gosh, I'm never going to be any good at this. Julio is demotivated because it's a beginner's course. He's already done all this stuff. and he switched off. And we're both lazy boys, and we have a chat, and languages becomes a long way down our priority list. Now, that sort of situation happens in secondary school. So that is one of the big issues of transition. There's not the joined up thinking between what's gone on in the primary school to what's gone on in the senior school. Okay, there are some exceptions to this, but the reality is, if you take a secondary school in the UK, take mine for example, we have about 45 feeder primary schools. Okay, it's really difficult to achieve consistency with regards to what goes before year 7. So what goes on in primary languages. Sorry, I should have said beforehand, there's a strong chance that I will be interrupted by either my dog, which is my miniature schnauzer you can hear in the background, or one of my 2 children. I've got 2 young boys. Okay, so apologies for Ray, my dog. Okay, let's carry on. And then we have other issues with the lower secondary curricula as well, and we'll come on to those a little bit later as we progress through the talk. Okay. So what the Key Stage 2 national curriculum says for languages in UK is actually really positive. You look at it and think, wow, languages are really supported here. Okay, so what's the problem? So if you just I'll give you a chance to have a little read of that. And I will read it aloud as well. Teaching may be of any modern or ancient foreign language and should focus on enabling pupils to make substantial progress in one language. The teaching should provide an appropriate balance of spoken and written language and should lay the foundations for further foreign language teaching at Key Stage 3. Key Stage 3 is secondary school, the early stages of secondary school in England. It should enable pupils to understand and communicate ideas, facts, and feelings in speech and writing, focused on familiar and routine matters, using their knowledge of phonology, grammatical structures, and vocabulary. So, yeah, on the surface, that looks okay. The problem is, who's going to teach it? Okay, what is substantial progress? Well, that varies from school to school. There is a notable absence of culture there, like Gemma mentioned in the chat. And it's all a little bit vague. It feels like a bit of a box-ticking exercise. And actually, that's exactly what it ends up being in too many primary schools in the UK, despite their best intentions. Okay, so yeah, and there's also the early indication that there is some joined up thinking with the curriculum, because those of you familiar with English, how English as a first language is being taught in primary schools in England, there's a lot more focus now on grammatical structures, on phonology, and vocabulary. So there is that in the last bit of that of that extract, there is that opportunity to start meshing things together on the curriculum, have that connectivity on the curriculum. But the reality is that it's really hard to deliver on for too many primary schools. Okay. What happens every year in the UK in the spring, as language professionals, we are invited to contribute to this survey by the British Council. Okay, Language Trends Survey. You can, and this year's report is available through the British Council website. You can have a look at it. Usually they try and put some sort of positive angle on things, but often this becomes a bit of a depressing read for lots of language professionals, and there'll be people in the room who are familiar with this who I'm sure would agree with me. But there's some positive news this year for primary school. So 4 out of 5 primary schools have been teaching languages as part of the normal school day for more than 5 years. This represents a 2% increase on 2021, and you can read on the rest of it. So there's some good news there as well, but are we really finding enough time for languages? You know, this idea of, those of you have taught in primary schools, may have children in primary schools, you know that sometimes what a timetable looks like, what the curriculum looks like, has to be very flexible. You know, if there's a school trip or something else, if they've got a visitor in one day, if they're doing things have to give, and often the thing that gives is languages, any language provision. The schools that I've taught, because I'll talk about how I deliver primary languages in a little while. Often in the first couple of years when I was doing it, it was my Spanish lesson or my WoLLoW lesson from which students who had learning support needs were taken out to do perhaps extra reading or extra maths with a teaching assistant. You know, why was it the language lesson that had to suffer there, without a full class? Okay, so we started thinking, how can we do it differently at primary and early secondary? Now, my teaching of this has mostly been for primary, okay, because what we have at instead of a Cheadle Theme School, we have our own primary school on site, and we'll be looking at, okay, how should we go about teaching languages at our own senior school. We also have partner primary schools state primary schools across the Stockport area. So Stockport is a borough of Manchester to the south of Manchester, and the way it started was, well, I would give up a Tuesday afternoon, I would go off to another primary school and teach Spanish, okay, for a block of 8 weeks at one primary school. I would teach the Spanish. The kids, I hope, would have a great time doing all the Spanishy stuff. And then after the 8 weeks, I would go to another school and do the same thing. The problem was that they just did 8 weeks and then it stopped. We all know as linguists that it's important to have that continuity. Okay, the interruptions are just not good for learning. We're seeing that even between when there's a summer holiday between learning. We all know how much students forget. So these young people were just having this block of 8 weeks and then no Spanish at all, perhaps until they got to senior school. That wasn't ideal. Okay, and the other thing that wasn't ideal, it was very much an add-on. It was very much a sort of a nice to have, rather than a fundamental part of the curriculum. When we were coming up with the thinking behind WoLLoW, we thought actually, language learning can be fundamental at the core, at the heart of curriculum. And this is what we wanted. We wanted to, rather just to prioritize one language over another, we wanted students to be excited and curious about languages as a whole. We wanted students to see, as you can see in the quote there, the patterns between languages, how languages link together, okay? And how languages sort of come to exist, the sort of journey that a language goes on. We talk about etymology of individual words, but the sort of how they connect geographically, historically, religiously, this sort of thing. So the idea is that we thought, well, if we can create a course where by the time students get to year 7 secondary school, they are excited, they get why we have language diversity, they get how languages can link to so many other areas of the curriculum, they understand that different languages work differently, okay? The fact that they understand that when we're talking about age, for example, in English we say I am 7 years old, whereas in Spanish we say I have 7 years. They understand that languages have come to be through very different journeys, and therefore things are said differently. So that was the idea. And the other idea was, how workable was it? Well, it's not sustainable to expect senior school teachers to go out and teach every single primary school student their language. So we wanted a set of resources, a good materials, which a primary school teacher, albeit with a little bit of direction, a little bit of training in inverted commas, can confidently deliver with their class. We also wanted it to be really flexible, because each primary school represents a very different community. So, for example, of the primary schools that I work with in Stockport, everyone is very different. There's one in quite a leafy, affluent suburb of Stockport, and a lot of the kids are very lucky to go abroad on holiday. They get languages from that angle. But there isn't much actual language diversity within the school with regards to bilingual students. Whereas another school I work with in an area called Kale Green in Stockport, about half of the students in my year 4 class were bilingual. They weren't bilingual with Spanish, they weren't bilingual with French, with German, those sort of traditional subjects on our curriculum. They were bilingual with Bengali and English, Urdu and English. So we wanted to celebrate. We wanted to be flexible in our WoLLoW program, so that we could really make students value the other languages in their lives, perhaps the language they use to communicate with granddad. It's also interesting that some students, some of these young people knew they spoke in a different way, in a different tongue perhaps, with a certain relative, but they weren't even able to say what that language was because it hadn't been valued. It had been sort of marginalized perhaps in the UK curriculum in favor of maybe Spanish, French and German. We want to celebrate all languages. Didn't want to say, it's not necessarily, the importance of the language is not necessarily connected to the number of speakers. The importance of language, in my view, is its importance to you. If it's a fundamental part of who you are and your identity, then it has to be a priority for you. Okay. So, yeah, there are the aims of WoLLow, and hopefully you'll see how it can connect with different areas of the curriculum as well. I think it's our hope is, and this is certainly because WoLLow is also something that can be used in the lower secondary school, is how it will benefit English as well, first language learning. Okay, so I'm hoping that this will work as I go to the resources page for WoLLow. Now, if you go to the WoLLow website, which is linked, it will be linked with the information. I hope now you can see the resources shout out if you can. So effectively, they are grouped as primary resources, Key Stage 2, and secondary resources, Key Stage for Year 7, and secondary resources for Year 8. So that's lower Key Stage 3, so lower secondary. You can see the sorts of things that we do, and I'll open a few of them. So, for example, multilingual me. Each resource has a worksheet. Each resource has a presentation. Multilingual me here. It's sort of celebrating that language diversity within the group of students that you have, and making students realize that they are perhaps more multilingual than they think they are. So the languages they know. Okay. Come to terms with the terminology as well, and that's one of the areas where it can be it links. So for example, multilingual. Okay, what other words do you know? This is the sort of conversation you're having with an 8-year-old child. What other words do you know that have multi at the start? So of course they think, oh, they might have made good progress with multiplication, for example, and then you can start breaking those words down, breaking those prefixes down, and they are constantly seeing the value of language there. But yeah, so this is an example of making them realize they live in a sort of multilingual world, a multilingual class, a multilingual school, and that's part of them realizing how important languages are for them. So yeah, you can work your way through the different resources, and just like I said before, because we've designed these resources so they don't have to be taught by an expert, they can be taught by a primary generalist. So we have a crib sheet for each lesson. What I do though is I make a copy of these resources and adapt them to the class in front of me, because as I've said before, each school is there's a very different linguistic context in each school. Now, what we have is in Manchester, we are extremely fortunate. I've already mentioned how fortunate I feel to have the Cervantes on my doorstep, but those of you who are Mancunians among you may be aware that we claim to be the most linguistically diverse city in Western Europe. Can just in the chat, part of that claim, how many languages do you think are represented within Manchester? Within as languages which speakers would say are their first language. How many languages do you think are represented? Let's have a little. People in the chat, maybe give me a number. Languages represented in Manchester as first languages. Who dares put something in the chat? Go on, let's see what you can do. Good. So, well, yeah, John is about bang on, but he's probably heard me say this before about a million times. So we can't be sure, but there are about, and 200 is at the upper end of the estimate. We think there are about 200 languages represented in Manchester as first languages. So. And the University of Manchester did quite a lot of research into this and have celebrated it through the concept of multilingual Manchester. You can see the the logo there for Multilingual Manchester. So we bring that as part of our WoLLoW lessons. And of course, when you got that sort of class that I had, where we have about half of the young people are bilingual, representing part of that multilingualism, whether it's through whatever language that is, that and we Urdu, Bengali, Gujarati, whatever, so many languages represented within these classrooms. I then tend to show them this video, and it really encourages them to think about this multilingualism. Carlos, could I ask you to share this video, which is a video of a poem about language diversity in Manchester, if that's okay.
Manchester is a city proud of its diverse communities and rich mix of cultures and languages. I wanted to celebrate that diversity and decided that creating a multilingual poem would be a great way for us all to get together. I asked local poet Zaid Hussain to create a poem and asked Manchester's communities to contribute. You've told us what the city means to you, and we've created a poem with over 50 languages. The poem will continue to grow as we add more and more languages. I'm extremely proud to introduce you to Made in Manchester.
We are made in Manchester, we are spun from hope. We are a city united forever, braided into a single rope.
Mangkunian dan kilang tekstil mungkin tanggapan pertama Anda.
Ní hawan ag tógáil spéir scagadóirí ach muilte drehead is tithe.
Place fi balong. Place fi dia.
Lakin wano nakana ilalafaha.
Kila mtu amekaribishwa.
Kila mtu ni rafiki.
Manchester kujua karakter.
手牵着手，我们奔向未来。
Sommer an Registrationen tragen, werde die bleiben, tragst du Zuma.
Abbiamo molti tipi di facce e molti tipi di grazie.
我們以萬設施特為傲，為我們有着蜜蜂般精神的市民而自豪，更為我們是龍的傳人而感到光榮。每個人是獨特的個體，但大家都同樣具備了精彩的文化背景和堅定的信仰。
मैनचेस्टरी मुझे मुस्कुराते चुंबकुरनुक एतम बैठम। हम हैं एक दूसरे की सहायता के लिए, हम हैं एक साथ हमेशा के लिए.
Kibo o Yorokobino
Mēs nekad nezaudēsim savu identitāti.
Eu musa yeka kasa ahodon pimpin.
Nansu bibiaren hon me beteti entem.
Προσφέρει φιλοξενία, ζεστασιά και ελπίδα σε ανθρώπους από όλα τα πέρατα του κόσμου.
Gdzie błyszczą światła, gdzie ulice przyjazne, gdzie nikt nigdy nie jest samotny.
Lacriam do nosso lar.
Dwi'n dwlu ar y lle yma, mae'n hudol, fy ninas mabwysiadol anhygoel.
ഞങ്ങൾ എല്ലാ റോസാപ്പൂവിന്റെ ഉള്ളതലങ്ങളാണ്.
من شستار البيت السعيد.
Amra Sabah Samya Eksate Taktapari.
Amar Shunar Manchester. Ami tumai balobashi.
Ang anto pakalahi lahi mowe mopilte sa ato. Mamagayo gana ang kukmamakatu kanayo.
Manchester hiya jariya tina. Dien kompong cha bong hai nek do day nar pdia.
Sesh fanzele karka Manchester. Wantum pali pali huya se woteni moye.
Vijay uk nodig hebt wisselen oudhuisjaren.
Koi amari juda nei kari shake.
Бид хүмүүстэй ажилладаг бас хүмүүстэй байдаг. Хүмүүсийг хизээч чунгадаггүй.
Мы сложены из многих культур, но живем в гармонии.
Manchester es nuestra fortaleza. Manchester es nuestro corazón.
En plats at verlichli och songe oskraja. At vite at alla avi igen.
Kami ay isang pamilya.
Manchester her zaman sizin için buradadır. O halde arkanızda yaslanıp rahatlayın, manzaranın keyfini çıkarın.
Spindente rishkesh wikje shokente tangos klote. Teli ngatim timo wow kulu.
C'est notre endroit de réconfort.
Manchester er vårt livsstil, hvor livet vårt beginnet.
Manchester da fotball.
Silo kishe ebodanoke, sibokate ubakati.
We may speak 1,000 tongues, but none will dare divide us. We'll always be too strong, because we are truly one.
Okay, Carlos, thank you. Okay, so, I mean, thank you for letting me show you that. What I think, just consider the power of that when you show that to a sort of an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, 10-year-old child, and the message that's getting across about the key messages about diversity, about how the fabric of our city, and also the number of things that you can do with that. For example, just 50 languages are represented on that poem. You may have someone in your class whose language wasn't represented. Okay, well, you add to the poem with your language, please. In that school, Kale Green, that I was talking to, we did our own version of this video. I don't have the permissions yet to share it, that's why it's not this, but we talked about multilingual Kale Green Primary School. So all of I think we've got about 30 languages represented within that school. So we had a poem there to celebrate that language diversity. Okay, and for those students who you might be thinking about the students who perhaps only got English, and maybe feeling a bit, oh gosh, well, I've only got English. Well, actually, no, they really felt a part of this. And those who were lucky enough to have another language were able to share something of themselves, and the whole, and there was still that message of languages are really important. Language is a really vibrant part of our societies. Right. So back to WoLLoW. What I do with WoLLoW with regards, so I deliver WoLLoW with secondary schools. I support primary school teachers in the Stockport area in delivering WoLLow in their schools. Being a Hispanist at heart, I do like to include a little bit of a Spanish angle to my WoLLow lessons. Whilst it is designed not to focus on a specific language, my go-to is Spanish to discuss some of the themes. For example, does anyone know who Ana Maria Bordas is? There's a clue in the back behind her there. Yeah, she is effectively, I don't know her official title, but effectively she's in charge of Spain's Eurovision entry. Okay, and you can. So I'm just going to be giving a few examples of what I've done with WoLLow with regards to Spanish. And you can see in the top right there, that was Spain's entry. I've forgotten her name, but I remember it being a little bit controversial. And the slight disappointment that I always get at Eurovision, and you may share this disappointment, is that most of the countries end up singing in English. So as I came to my Year 5 lesson, I said, "Oh, did you watch Eurovision on Saturday?" They said yes. Okay, wasn't it a shame? I was really disappointed. Why am I disappointed? Why is Mr. Wilson disappointed today? Yes, because the Spanish I was looking for was listening to some Spanish, and they were singing in English. Okay. Whereas I really loved the French entry last year. There they are at the bottom. Can anybody remember? But they didn't sing in French. Can you remember in which language they sung in the French entry on the chat? Anybody remember? I haven't got access to the chat long, so I'm still sharing. But the answer is Breton. So this group sang in Breton. I thought it was brilliant. Okay, so the task that my Year 5s had was to write to Ana Maria Bordas to express disappointment as to why the Spanish entry wasn't in Spanish or in a language of Spain, right? Because obviously the French language is in Breton, so yeah, in Spanish or in Gallego or in Basque or in Catalan, but a language of Spain, please, for the entry. So that was a really good exercise. You got to think about why that was important to them. why we wanted a multilingual Eurovision Song Contest. So that sort of thing, it was a good exercise. Unfortunately, and then I put it together, their response, I put them together and sent them off to Ana Maria Bordas. I'm still waiting for my response from Ana Maria, but I'm sure it's on the way. So and if it comes out, I'll share it with you. So that was quite a nice exercise. The other sort of curriculum link. So geography is a big one. I've always secretly wanted to be a geography teacher. Well, teaching WoLLoW is my opportunity to be that geography teacher. So we can talk about the geography behind the languages of Spain, for example, and being quite an affluent school. Here I am in September. A lot of my students have been to Mallorca, Menorca over the summer, to quote these sort of British stereotypes, and they're wondering why. It didn't sound like Spanish what I was listening to, and that's because they would have been hearing Mallorquin, branches of Catalan, for example. And we can have conversations about that, and we can look at how those languages link, okay, and how sometimes. And we can look at why Basque sort of doesn't link so much or at all. So we can look at the geography, the linguistics of geography of Spain, and how that connects to France as well, and Portugal, and they find this stuff interesting. And onto this map. Now, first of all, don't assume that they know where this is. So first of all, I would ask her, so this is a map of where? Most people say Spain. I say, okay, well, Spain and Portugal, Iberian Peninsula thing going on here. And then we look at these people, A, B, C, D, and E, and I asked them the question. So, who understands who? So that when these people have a conversation with each other, who understands who? And that leads to some quite good discussion as well. Okay, so if you all have a little think about who understands who there. And the question that asked, and then the question why. Now, you may have other opinions on this. So first of all, does D understand C? Yes. And then we talk about why. Well, yeah. Whilst D's first language or preferred language might be Mallorquin, that person will be bilingual and would comfortably have a conversation in Spanish with C. So D and C will be able to understand each other fine. What about C and E? Well, similarly, it could be that E's first language is Gallego or preferred language is Gallego, but likely to be bilingual. So yeah, they would probably C and E would understand each other well as well. What about D and E? Well, they might choose to use Spanish again. Perhaps for both of them, that's not their favoured language, but they would choose to speak to each other in that. B, I think B would understand E, D, and C. And then becomes the interesting one, A and B. A and B live, let's for the sake of this conversation, live a mile apart, but that either side of the border. Now, we get into discussion such as, okay, why might A and B understand each other, albeit that politically they're speaking different languages? One speaking Portuguese, one speaking Spanish. Why might A and B understand each other? Why might B understand A, but C doesn't understand A? We get to all this interesting discussions like this, so the idea of sort of the politics of language and why sometimes the language you speak is a label and it's not quite as black and white as that's Spanish, that's Portuguese, that sort of thing. So young people find this stuff interesting in my experience, and it leads to some interesting discussions, and they link it to other regions of the world as well. And that's something that I've learned. Is just stop and listen to these young people. That tells me that time's up, so I better go on. Now, into secondary school, the problem is that secondary language learning, and often because we are starting as beginners courses, it can be pretty dull, because we've got a first lesson in year 7, start of section, and they're letting us say their name. My name is Me llamo John. Okay? Now, more exciting as we try to make it, that content is pretty dull, because in their history lesson, they're doing all sorts of exciting stuff. In their geography lesson, they're doing all sorts of exciting. In their science lesson, they're doing all sorts of exciting stuff. And sometimes the content at beginner's language level is pretty dull. So like Gemma said, we need to get loads of culture in there. We need to bring in those other disciplines as well to make it more exciting. Okay. The way we assess is really important as well. In our school, we've started having competency-based assessment. moving in this grid where you see assessment, you won't see the word accuracy. And that's a conscious decision, because we think that part of the problem is that we are far too obsessed with measurables in language learning in the UK. It needs to be about communication to build that sort of motivation and enjoyment. So they are what we prioritize in our assessment. Okay, and we'll move on a bit quicker. The other thing we've looked at is sort of how languages in the secondaries, we've come up with a thing called the big questions. So two big questions in our lower school curriculum are, what can I learn from beyond the UK? So in every single subject across the curriculum, they are looking at that question. And what shapes our identity? Now, suddenly, thanks to these big questions, language, you can see, well, that's great for modern language learning. That's great for Spanish learning, for French learning, for German. Suddenly, what has historically in the UK, in England, been on the periphery, now can get closer to the core. And we can just look at these bigger questions, and we can really drive that conversation on those big questions. Because the other thing that we need to consider is, and the issues with lower secondary, is the actual curriculum time we often get can be pretty poor. To give you an example, in year 9, so in year 9, that's the third year of secondary, we have 3 hours a fortnight. We have a 2-week time, so we have 2 hours one week, 1 hour the next week. And I think that's rubbish. But and in year 8, it's a little bit better. We have 2 hours one week and 2 hours the next week. But we all know that it's a little bit often is the key. It's just like learning an instrument. You need to keep going and keep practicing. So if languages are coming up elsewhere in the curriculum because through these big questions, then that's got to help us. It also reinforces the importance of the things they do outside of languages. So we, for example, really valued theatre and drama in language learning. So we have a co-curricular club for theatre. And we have a visiting theatre group. This one's called the Onati Productions, which you may be aware of. And they're really good. So we have a pair of professional actors that go on tour delivering. This is the one in next year. Me personally, so they're coming to us in February to perform, and they're absolutely brilliant. And there's follow-up work to these plays. The plays are interactive, and yeah, it works really well. Partner schools are really important. I've already mentioned Escola Mericel at the start, and any Catalan experts will be able to translate their sort of slogan, their motto there. But so that's for exchanges, but also e-learning. Okay, there's loads of cool stuff you can do. For example, with European Languages Day next week, we've got loads of just connecting students together, getting them to speak to each other. We're also doing something with sending recordings over and sending recordings back, answering questions that are difficult to answer. For example, las mariposas, ¿por qué tienen alas de colores? Okay, that's the question. That's interesting content. So go off and research that and come back with an answer in Spanish that's actually going to further your knowledge, using language as the vehicle to find more knowledge. Those sort of activities. Another partner school we have in Madrid is sort of Conde de Orgaz. And then a wider charity that we work with is Fundación Pies Descalzos, which is Shakira's charity, which is based on education in Colombia. So we sponsor a child through his education in that school. We raise money for that child. We communicate with that child and get communication in Spanish from that child. Nicolas, he's called, and that's really motivating for our students. So there's some, and of course, the traditional exchanges as well. Post-COVID, we can now get back on with those. So there's lots of things we can do with partner schools. The other thing that I would share is competitions such as mother tongue, other tongues. So this is a poetry competition. Again, no emphasis on accuracy. It's about creativity. So this was an entry that made it into, I don't know if you see my screen, it made it into the anthology this year. So one of the competition winners from my school, there's the anthology. And this is a national event. This is the Northwest branch. So this is a poem called El Rey Perro. There it is. So the idea is that it's the perro being the narrator, and he talks about mi humano se llama Ben. So it's turned on its head a little bit. So encouraging that creativity is what I'm getting at there. Okay. And finally, this encouraging reading, and this is my opportunity to plug what Julio was talking about at the start. So what I wanted students to be reading something that was sort of relevant to them. Julio got it a little bit wrong in that they weren't visiting Madrid. These three, Edu, Neus, and Hassan, live in Madrid. They all go to the same school, the more observant among you will see that they actually all go to the school Instituto Conde de Orgaz. So it links to our students' wider experience of the partner school. So they all go to that school, these fictional characters. You can see the first chapter is all based on Edu and his experience. If you just read that first paragraph, me llamo Edu, vivo en España desde hace 8 años y antes vivía en Lima, la capital de Perú, en un orfanato enorme. Mis padres, Manolo y Julio, los dos madrileños, me adoptaron. Tengo 13 años y soy alumno de primero de la ESO en el Instituto Conde de Orgaz, Madrid. You'll notice there, perhaps more observant, we're talking about there, the word padres actually means padres. His parents are Manolo y Julio, who adopted him from his original home in Peru. This opens up lots of discussion about sort of diversity and that sort of thing, and also interesting language questions. Is the term padres still fit for purpose in Spanish, or should we be coming up with another word for parents? The students say, oh, what about parientes? I said, well, we can't really have parientes because that's already taken. That's a false friend. That means relatives. So there's all these sorts of interesting discussions that come up whilst encouraging reading and whilst building that cultural capital. If you were interested in that book, please feel free to get back to me. And that's it really, as a bit of an overview of what I've been doing to try and make the sort of poor hand we get sometimes work in primary languages and lower secondary languages. I'm very interested in opening up the discussion. I'm sorry I've overrun. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That has been very, very inspirational. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions and comments. I'm still processing all the information. I would love to attend a real WoLLoW class once at some point. I wonder if you guys have any recordings in the resources of actual sessions, or
if you go to the WoLLoW website, which is linked in the presentation, there is a recording to sort of what we're all about, and you will see some snippets of lessons in there. But it's certainly something that we can consider, especially with regards if we want these resources to be used by primary school generalists who are not necessarily language experts. It's certainly something we can consider to some sort of almost like tutorial lessons or exemplar lessons. And I should say that, you know, in talking about resources, John Clawton and me, we have contributed to the resources, but they are largely the work of our colleague at Norwich School, who's Abby Dean. So that's a good thing for us to bring up at our next meeting, John.
Excellent. So are there any questions either via the chat, or if you would like to unmute yourselves at this point, please feel free to do so. There are a couple of comments from earlier on regarding bits and pieces of your talk. So for instance, Gemma notes that languages are promoted very little in the United Kingdom and are optional in most schools. There's really no or little flexibility being given to MFL teachers at KS3 and 4 for language teaching. It's basically grammar and vocabulary that are taught. The focus is on those rather than on communication. There is really no homogeneity in primary, and most times languages are first introduced at around year 4.
Yeah, and I mean, this certainly, I completely agree that you feel that there is this straitjacket, and often the straitjacket is the GCSE. That's sort of what we're heading towards. I've just come out of a meeting before this one at school, which was the main question was, should languages be compulsory at GCSE? That's because we've just had, we're getting more and more sort of weaker students for whom GCSE is not always ideal. That's because GCSE is obsessed with accuracy, and it's which sort of goes against. I mean, I love grammar because here I am. I love grammar. I love doing gap fills and understanding the ins and outs. But I would suggest that for most people trying to learn a language, it's about they want to communicate, and that can be quite off-putting. The problem is that GCSE, the way it's assessed for languages, is about effectively you need to speak in 3 time frames to get a grade which is considered a pass. So you need to be able to refer to the past, present, and future. You could be brilliant at communicating without using those tenses, those time frames. I'm sure, but unfortunately, the way GCSE works, you would be restricting yourself to sort of a grade 3, which is below what is considered to be a pass. That for me feels wrong and demotivating. Okay, but I completely agree with what Gemma says.
Yeah, absolutely. My feeling was that I kind of learned English that way. I'm not saying I'm a defender of gap fills, but in a way, you know, I remember when I first went to the UK, that was back in 2004 for my Erasmus year. I remember people telling me that my English was very bookish. Oh my God, yeah, it was, obviously, because I knew all the idioms from the dictionary and from the book and all the grammar, but, you know, I was using it inappropriately. It wasn't used properly in context and so on. And I think that was basically the result of, on the one hand, being overseas, which never helps. My teachers were great, but they were not native speakers. They weren't individuals who had spent a long time in an English-speaking country. But first and foremost, I think the reason was that it was all based on books. So it was kind of very linguistics, very literature-oriented, and therefore very technical, not realistic. But anyway, we managed. But I agree that certainly communication should be paramount. And
yeah, and I'm not just saying this because here I'm talking through the Cervantes Institute, but for example, for me, the answer to the question that at the meeting today that I was at, should languages be compulsory? Well, yes, I think they should, but not necessarily through GCSE. Right. There are other options, such as the DELE, which, whether we like it or, I'm trying to convince my senior team in my school. Actually, if I go to Spain, nobody understands GCSE, but DELE is our global benchmark for your ability in Spanish. That is global currency for Spanish. So wouldn't it make more sense for us to do a qualification that the Spanish-speaking world understands, or the equivalent in French, for example, the French-speaking world understands? Mm-hmm. For me, the answer is yes. And thankfully, yeah, accuracy is still important in the way that is assessed, but it's not. But there are lots of other elements, and I think that would be how I would want to take the curriculum at that sort of 15, 16, right. And I think that would really help things earlier on. It would really free up how we teach languages earlier on in the UK, because we wouldn't have this this straitjacket that is imposed by GCSE. Okay, thank you.
There's a follow-up by Dr. Sagna from the University of Manchester, and it reads as follows. Other than Spanish and French, which other languages spoken in Manchester are represented in the WoLLoW initiative? Are some minority languages also represented?
Yeah, so WoLLoW itself does not favour any language over another. It's about celebrating multilingualism. It's about seeing how different languages connect, both modern languages and classical languages. So we want to be able to respond to the range of languages in front of us in the classroom and within our communities, and make students aware of that. The way that I do it, and it's part of the flexibility, is that because, as I mentioned before, I tend to make my references, I use Spanish as my references because that's my sort of comfortable area. But one of the beauties of teaching WoLLoW is, I think as a language teacher, up until I started teaching WoLLoW, I always wanted to have the answer. Okay, I want to say, oh yeah, I can give you the answer to that. No, now because we're talking about lots of languages that I don't understand, and they're unfamiliar to me, you are sharing the experience with your learners, and that's very powerful to be able to say, I don't know how they do that in Japanese. Let's find out together. And that's really exciting. For a linguist, that's been really liberating, and it reminds you that you're not just a teacher, you're also a learner. And to have sort of 5-year-old children in front of you who are more of an expert, or much more of an expert, because they are bilingual in this language, in front of you, is is exciting as well. It's uncomfortable at the start because as a teacher, you're out of your comfort zone of being surrounded by young people with more expertise than you. But it's really exciting, and the thing I always say that my WoLLoW lessons they're the highlight of my week, my teaching week. I love teaching Spanish, but my WoLLoW lessons are looking more holistically about languages. They are the highlight.
It's really nice, and I recently heard the story of a teacher here in Spain along those lines, without knowing about WoLLoW or anything. They were singing happy birthday in Spanish to one of the kids, then they sang it in English because this was English. I think they were 7-year-olds, 6-7-year-olds, and then there was a Romanian student. So the teacher, a linguist, was sensitive enough to ask the kid to really sing in Romanian and tell us the words, tell the kids the words and so on. And she was so happy and so proud. So yeah, I'm sure she really told her family back home, about the experience. So absolutely.
And I have sung in school in an assembly the Catalan national anthem. So you better watch out. Otherwise I might start.
Some very good native speakers of Catalan in the room.
So I put a link to the WoLLoW website in the chat, but you can also access it through the presentation as well. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. theworldoflanguages.co.uk. So you all make sure you visit that website. It's full of resources, and well. So let me double check that there are no more questions. Okay, and if so, I think we can adjourn this wonderful meeting, unless there are any last-minute questions. No? All right. So, well, on behalf of the Instituto Cervantes of Manchester and Leeds, I would like to thank you all for being here. Thank, John Wilson for this wonderful and very inspirational talk. And, well, hopefully we will see each other soon for the next talk, which I think will take place in November. So stay tuned. And again, thank you very much. Thank you, John.